voila. Oh, I forgot my mic. Jeez Louise.
You brought a sweater because I think it got cool.
Oh, yes, I have.
It's getting hot.
Oh. That was my house.
My basement's too cold.
In the summertime, that's where I escaped to, was the basement. I escaped to my basement in the summertime because it's so much cooler down there.
You're just right?
And it works perfectly because Carolyn always cold, so she could be sitting in 90-degree weather and be happy, but not me.
It's a subdued crowd today.
Everybody went to the beach.
Everybody went to the beach, got your suntans. I did not go to the beach. What did I do yesterday? I did a bunch of housework yesterday. Just laundry, vacuumed, cleared a clog out of the downstairs shower.
Did a honey-do list.
Yeah.
But it was an air conditioner.
It was air conditioning.
Yeah. My granddaughter competed in the state band competition yesterday.
Was it indoors?
It was indoors at the Oregon State University.
What grade is she in?
She's a sophomore in high school.
Okay.
And she did great.
What was it? Solo and ensemble or like orchestra?
It's a wind ensemble.
Okay.
Yeah, she plays the flute.
That's what I was.
She was right up front.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you know what pieces they perform?
No, but I got that. It was
Good.
some good ones. I mean, so the band before that had these modern pieces. It just sounds like a lot of noise.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Artsy pieces.
Yeah, they actually placed in the top.
You look good. You look very
My
good.
daughter's band, which had like
You look
music
very
about
good.
rivers and other.
I like your blouse.
Said about something else. All made sense. About music. Get it. Fit in place.
Oh, that's okay. Well, so in Michigan, we didn't do, you weren't competing per se. So it wasn't, they weren't ranking you against other bands. The way that we did it was that, or the way they did it was, they had grading categories. So it was kind of like you get a first or a second or a third or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I didn't feel like we were competing against other bands. But you definitely watch the other bands to like judge them whether or not. My band director had always had winning bands, ours included, right?
Yeah.
So he was he was a nice guy. He was a good band director, but he very intentionally picked the music based on what he thought would, score well. But Jay was usually good stuff. We did a couple of the, off the wall pieces, but then my senior year we did Carmina Burana, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that piece. It's got this great dun 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 dun. You'd recognize it.
Yeah.
Dun 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 dun. But I got to play the English horn for Carmina Burana, which has an English horn solo in it, which terrified me. Terrified me. I mean, thanks. These are my I have two, these are my wedding boots. I got these for my wedding. My problem is they're slick on the bottom. So I've almost biffed it like 3 or 4 times this morning. But I figured I'd go for lighter colors for spring. But they always told you brown and black don't mix, but light brown. Light brown.
As a designer, brown and black are fine.
Thank you. I'm going to tell anybody that critiques me. I consulted at the end.
And a professional.
A professional. Okay. Okay, so first things first. In review, were there any hanging pieces from our conversation? We never really did talk substitutionary atonement or penal. Yeah, we never did talk vicarious atonement.
Can I just make a comment?
Please.
I wasn't here at the end of 2 of those sessions.
You were singing.
I was singing, yeah. I believe that the misunderstanding of vicarious atonement is more in the Protestant world in the last 500 years that says, well, in contrast to needing, a priesthood between us and God, and we're meaning a vicar like the Pope and all his bishops and priests, then we have this direct access, and it's such a beautiful atonement that we have nothing to do in this life, or can do nothing for our salvation. Therefore, we don't need to be active in the world. We can, wait for Jesus to come back on a hill and be good, and kind of thing. And so the idea of substitutionary atonement has become one in which theologically people have trouble understanding their responsibilities as disciples.
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough. And there's another word which we haven't really used here, but it's an important one. Christology, right? Have you heard this word before, Christology? The theology, right? Theology about Christ. So when you're talking theology in its various forms, as a Christian, this is kind of front and center, right? Is who do you say that Christ is? And it's an important thing to think about and to talk about, because if you look at the history of Christianity, this has kind of been the front and center major argument. This is where you get people splitting churches and burning people at the stake and all those wonderful things is about this, right? We don't really get into knockdown drag out fights about the nature of God as portrayed by the Old Testament all that much. This is the thing that we get where sticks in the mud about.
We get more divided just in the theology of it.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. But and I wrote that word up there because like atonement in Christianity is kind of the thing that you're talking about in Christology as well too. I mean, it's Christology, atonement, right? The circle within a circle. But what we're talking about, or what Paul brought up here is the danger of any theology or any Christology, because this, and you may not be aware of this fact, but this is a 4-letter word in progressive Christianity today, and these are sort of synonymous: vicarious atonement, penal substitutionary atonement, because, well, for reasons. But all theologies start with good intent, right? Nobody sets out to describe a God that is bad, right? All theologies are attempting to describe God in a way that makes sense to the person creating that theology in the context, the culture, and the world that they live, right? It comes out of that as much. So like one of the things that we can often talk about is the theology of Christianity changes significantly, especially after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because the pressures of living get pretty nuts, right? You've got plagues and wars and more wars and high mortality rates, lack of infrastructure, lack of governance, feudal states, vying with each other. It's a rough time to be alive, especially if you're a plebeian, a peasant, right? A land worker. You're not on the top. You're not getting access.
You just described what we're going through now.
And yeah. I mean, yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but so what Paul named here is that this idea of vicarious atonement, which you'll hear, maligned.
What does vicarious mean?
In place of, with in place of, yeah.
Okay.
So, kind of the core idea here is that there's nothing that we need to do for our salvation. It's something that happens to us, which is front and center in Lutheran theology.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. And therefore, how shall we live?
Therefore, how shall we live? And that second part of it is kind of the core question. Because people have gone 2 directions with it. Well, many directions, but 2 directions. So Paul already named one, which is Okay, I'm saved. I can kind of just sit back and wait for it to happen, right?
Everything's cool.
Everything's cool, man. But then, obviously, one of the questions then is, when does it happen? Right, which leads to a lot of the fun conversations that happened in the late 19th, early and late 19th centuries about when does it happen, you know. October 21st, 18, whatever, you know, being the hot date. But then also it goes another direction, which is, you know, okay, instead of sitting back on our laurels, okay, if our salvation is taken out of our hands, and I'm being snarky, and we know that certain people aren't saved, well then how does that work?
Screw up.
Yeah, heck with them. How does God decide, right? But more importantly, how do we know who's in and who's out?
Well, the problem is, do you know?
But yeah, Andy, you're making the obvious statement there, which is calling into question this ridiculous concept.
If you know, maybe you really don't know.
If you think, yeah, that's a pretty safe, that's a pretty solid statement to make about theology in general. Yeah, it's because who says that?
Epistemology.
Epistemology, yeah.
How do you know what you know?
How do you know? But who's the one that I don't know. It's always Abraham Lincoln, right? But it's you know, stupidity is not ignorance. Stupidity is ignorance to your ignorance, or something like that. You know.
Well, you don't know what you know.
Not yet. Yeah.
You don't know.
Thinking you know what you don't know, something like that. Yeah. Sorry, I got off on that. We're off the track. Let's finish this track out. So yeah, so right. This is even when we're talking about what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus. Right at the beginning, we talked about, you know, one of the concepts that you have to think about is, well, who's Jesus? Or who's the Jesus that I'm following? What's our Christology? Right? What do we believe about this guy? Because again, we're following what? A metaphor, an idea, a teaching, a symbol. Right? We don't have the physical guy standing in front of us that can say to us, no, that's wrong. You know, no, that's not who I am. But this happens to us as human beings as well too, right? When you're not present in a room and you get talked about, or people represent you, right? Do they represent you, or do they represent their idea of you, right? And, you know, so what do we say when we're being talked about? Are your ears burning? In French, they say, are your ears whistling? Yeah. So, and it's funny because there are so many French and American idioms that do kind of line up, but there are so many that almost line up and don't. So Ellen, several, you know, all the time, will ask we'll be talking about my dad on a call, and she'll ask him, were your ears whistling? It's like, what are you talking about? My ears whistling. And he's half deaf anyways. So, you know, no, the tinnitus hasn't come back. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so let's round this out. So yeah, when we're following Jesus, it's really important to talk about who we think we're following, right? And this is a big part of it, because also in our discipleship, we talked about this. Last week? Yeah, last week, right? What does it mean to proclaim the good news, to talk about the good news of Jesus? If the good news is that there's nothing that you need to do for your own salvation, that's good news, right? Don't need to put an asterisk next to that. But if it's the good news that there's nothing you can do for your salvation, but God has preordained those who will be chosen to be saved, suddenly it's not as good news anymore, right? But this is what humans do, right? Is we take something that at face value seems to be pretty plain, right? So coming out of, you know, Protestant theology, this idea that there's nothing that we need to do, but we take it and we hang on to it and we turn it over and we look at it and we pull it apart and we put it back together again and we say, that can't be all of it though, right? That can't be there has to be more than that. Because if there's nothing that we can do for our own salvation, there's nothing anybody can do for their own salvation, which means we as human beings have no control over our status as redeemed, right? And then what we do is we make a bunch of bullet points or footnotes to atonement, and we say, well, however, in case A, see reference B, in case see reference C, and this is why we kill each other. I'm being snarky, but I'm being honest, right? So much of human history has been, and it makes sense if you think about it, it's been essentially religious tribalism, right? Because that's what we're doing at the end of the day. We're saying, well, who gets saved are our people. Our people get saved. And we shape our theology to describe that, to make sure that it's our people. I mean, if you look at the theology of the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, that's, this is front and center. They historically, well, the dudes back in the day, prophet. In Brooklyn, yeah, read Revelations. You can't say literally because they didn't literally read Revelations. They figuratively, concretely interpreted Revelation. So when it says the 12 by 12,000, right, which if you understand basic math, it's 144,000. They took that to be describing exactly how many people, which 144,000 seems like a lot until you realize that 144,000 fits in the big house for the University of Michigan's football team, right? I think it's like 112, but so it's the same order of magnitude. So this original guy was like, well, 144,000 get saved, but what happens when you get more than 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses? Then it's the cloud of witnesses. It's the cloud, because then Revelation talks about these concentric circles beyond that. Anyways, my point being is that, yeah, everything is about making sure that our tribe is the tribe that gets saved. What does being saved give you? And the temporal understanding gives you power over the people around you because you control the definition of salvation and you control people. Right? We hold very dangerous tools in our hands as disciples.
Yeah.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, for me, the difficulty is that when we proclaim unconditional agape,
Yeah.
as a love that has no conditions at all, it doesn't depend upon our response to that love. We don't take that and go, oh, that is the pattern of Christian love. In other words, we are to love everyone without condition, and we just don't want it.
Yeah.
I mean, no, I just don't want to love you without conditions. You need to really shape up, and then I can count you as somebody worthy of my consideration, my time, my energy, my money, right? We have that disconnect is, I think, the most profound disconnect there is in human history, right? God loves me without condition, but I can only love you with condition.
Mm-hmm.
And he loves me anyway because he loves me without condition. And so we've been chasing our tail for 2,000 years around this instead of just, I think, seeing it as, my gosh, it's an amazing thing. Try to love it unconditionally. Just try it. I mean, you absolutely can't do it even with the Spirit's help. It seems like, right? Well, I don't know.
This is the sermon this morning, right?
Yeah, okay.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm going to have you do the same short talk before I preach.
I'm just saying, this is our problem. It's the same problem that you brought up, I think, very beginning of our discussion about discipleship, which is, boy, that Jesus is a great guy, but his followers are bullshit.
Yeah. Well, this is what Gandhi's famous statement, right? I like your Christianity, I don't like your Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jesse, I have a hard time thinking that unconditional
Love.
grace
Yeah.
on the evil people in this world.
Yeah.
I have a very hard
Absolutely.
time with that.
Me too. Yeah.
I can't believe that Hitler has God's grace. I just can't. I have a very hard time with that.
And you can even bring it closer in than that, right?
Yeah.
That's at the extreme. There are days I have a hard time believing that my neighbors are experiencing God's grace. I'm being a little bit snarky, but I'm also not. I mean, maybe I inherited the famous Norwegian temper. I don't know.
The only thing that I can have in my heart is that I have unconditional love from God.
You get it.
Yeah, Carolyn,
You get it, Carolyn.
who brought the gold stars? Because somebody.
But does Adolf get it?
You got, yeah, but yeah, this is it, right? Okay, this is everything.
It's all
Okay.
right, but it has to be accepted.
Yes. Well, it doesn't. Well, yes, it does.
Yes.
Okay. So, Carolyn, you brought up the thing that makes us question this,
Yes.
Right.
which is, again, going back to, if God saves us no matter what, and I have no control over that process, that means there's a chance that God saves Adolf Hitler. Right? Again, that's a hard, bring it in a little closer, right? That means that God saves a Nazi soldier, right, who presided over one of the death houses.
Yeah.
Who was baptized Lutheran?
Who was baptized Lutheran, right? The same way that I was.
Same way.
What do I do with that? What do I do with that?
Well, I'm thinking about you said the soldier who was over. What about all the soldiers who are taking direction under these people? Yeah.
Oh man, but you're going down a rabbit hole here, right? Because that's an important question to ask.
Because in the military, you follow directions regardless of what you believe.
Yep.
Yeah. If you don't, there's consequences. Even if you're right, there can be consequences.
Yeah, but you do get to a place where, in the military, where you can run into situations where you gotta say, stop.
Yeah.
This isn't gonna happen.
My Line Massacre.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the only problem with that is, that's a nice judgment call for not being there. But
Yeah,
when you're
having been there,
when you're
I know
there-
exactly how it works. It's not a
Yeah.
good place to be.
Exactly.
It's terrible.
There is a lot of different kinds of love.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an interesting question to ask as well too. Is we acknowledge that God has this for us. Jesus seems to call us to go for this, right? He tells us to agape each other, right? Which unconditional agape is a repetition, right? I mean, agape, at least with the idea that the early Christians are working with, is unconditional. And that's a really good question or it's a good. Can I agape my enemies?
When you help them if they're down, if
Yeah.
they're wounded, you would help them. That's a form of love.
And what does that look? Yeah, and this is the point, right? It's like, can I love my enemies unconditionally? And what does that look like? Knowing that that potentially this other person wants to do violence to me.
But violence could be physical, violence could also be mental.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, certainly in the age of social media, we've got more enemies than we know we have.
We started out our discussion of discipleship with humility and curiosity.
Yeah.
But it's precisely because of this.
Yep.
Because it's unanswerable.
Yep.
In practicality, and it's why people like Bonhoeffer would say, well, I know I'm sinning in trying to kill Hitler. Because why? Well, because he's a human being and I shall not kill.
And yet I'm guilty of murder.
But I'm going to rely upon grace, that is the lesser of evils. But it is an evil. And I won't say it's a good.
And the model that Bonhoeffer kind of addresses this conundrum with is he talks about the idea of a human of free responsibility, right? Is that I as a human being, I am free. I have free will to choose to do whatever I'm going to do. But at the end of the day, I stand in judgment before the divine, and I plead my case, and he would argue my case is grace, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And when we've done that, my sense is that in the narrative that we live in this country now, that people cannot hear what we have to say because it seems to them like we're talking nonsense. It makes sense in America that you pay your debts, for instance. That credit and debt are everything. And that's why this is actually still, I think, pretty current in the world. And that when you pay your debt, it's said to have been redeemed. See? And you are redeemed in the eyes of your creditor. And the idea of vicarious atonement seems to have come down to, well, God, you didn't have the cash, so God paid your debt for you. Right? And then we kind of fly off into fairy tale land a little bit by saying, well, nobody has enough cash to pay off God, so of course God pays off the debt for us. And then we divorce it from our relationship with other human beings in history and in our neighbors who are alive today. So I feel like we have not got a good metaphor here to work with, especially in as much as the metaphor that does seem to be the most serious one is the relationship. Well, again, the fact that a banker can create money out of thin air. That's the most godlike thing I can think of.
But it leads to inflation, Paul.
Tough. I know how to get around that.
And
because
I'm being snarky though, but this is a real problem.
Yeah, it's very much a real problem.
Theologically and economically.
Right. So when is the consequence paid? Is the question, right? And so for Christians to say the consequence of our sinning, of our stupidity, our foolishness, our ridiculous way we treat each other on this planet, has already been it's already redeemed.
Yeah.
It's already done. And we try to speak the paradox, and therefore now I'm born into this situation, and I get to live my life in response to that.
Yeah.
And it's already, it's okay. We're all gonna be in heaven, and Carolyn, I have really wondered why we Protestants have given up on purgatory. Because it seems to me that there's a lot of purging that's necessary for me
Yeah.
to at all approach the divine. And somebody's going to have to be really cleaned up in me before I have.
It's a really interesting conversation to have, right, with your Catholic friends, by the way, is to claim purgatory as a temporal process, right?
Yeah.
In other words, it's not a state that we go to after death. It's an experience that we have in the now.
But it takes seriously that there is a purging.
Yes. This is a
that
great midway point to meet your Catholic friends at.
and other all humans.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use a broad term, we, as history is there.
Yep.
So we try to justify our actions.
Yep.
By using all these nice phrases and symbols, everything else to try to justify, but the end result is we're not really nothing.
Yeah, and again, my understanding, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer would very much agree with you.
Right. And he justified his because he thought it was
But-
the lesser of two evils.
Yep.
He understood
And
what he was doing.
and he simultaneously talks significant about how if they go through with this, he is a murderer, right? He owns that identity, which according to Matthew 6 is a condemnable act, right? So yeah, but again, there's a foundational Lutheran thing here which is going on, which is things in competing with each other, right? So we hold two disparate things in tension.
And that's why I said it's ours to accept,
Yeah.
because it's offered. But, is it a dogma that I'm going to save you no matter what you do?
Yeah.
I don't think that's what it is. I think it's like you're saved, but now it's your responsibility to understand and live by that. And
Well,
you can.
and we can see how very dangerous this idea that you need to be saved, I'm going to save you no matter what, is. Because, I'll be honest, a lot of the quote-unquote cultural issues that we're having right now stem from that.
Yes. It's my perspective, it's my point of view.
Yeah.
And it's not-
Religiously and culturally.
Right.
Yeah.
But my tribe is saved.
Yeah.
And yours is not.
and I'm doing an altruistic thing if I change you to fit me because I'm making sure that you are in my, you are saved.
But this isn't anything new.
No.
It's just that it's
No.
more available.
Our tactics have changed.
It's much more available.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the first crusade, well, second crusade, the first one wasn't super successful, but we raised, well, we didn't raise Jerusalem, we killed everybody inside, right? And then claimed the victory for Christ. Yeah. 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 I want to segue to our theoretically new topic. This is a great conversation, so I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to try to flow this conversation.
Well, okay, I'm going back to what you said.
Yeah.
I think that this has always been with us. It's never not.
It's never not with us.
Okay. So that I just want to clarify that I think the disciples, going out from the first century, have the exact same issues that we have. I mean, no, they're very, very close. I think we fantasize that the realm of possible issues is infinite. It really isn't in the human condition. In other words, the societal issues sure shift, which is the predominant paradigm shift, predominant metaphor shifts, whether it's atonement, sacrificial atonement, whatever, they shift, but the problems don't shift.
Yeah.
And they pre-exist Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah, they're human problems.
They are.
Don't you hate the sin and love the sinner?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then it's also simultaneously, how do we love somebody who is doing things that are harmful, right? That's the crux of that, right? Is that separating the sin from the sinner can be really tough at times. Yeah. Let me do my segue sort of. So where do we leave the disciples at, right? So end of the gospel narrative. Jesus has been crucified. Appears to the disciples and the women, right? Women first, then the disciples. Well, the women are disciples, but and then the text we looked at last week was kind of the intro into this, right? Which Jesus is talking to Peter, and he is essentially saying to Peter, Peter, I want you to practice this. This is the model for Christianity, right? Do this. And of course, the question that you would ask is, well, to who? And Jesus go, exactly, right? That's a good question, Peter. And I hope you keep asking that question. One of the realities for us in the 21st century, especially in a world where our cultural identities are constantly in flux, but also challenged, right? Because this is, I've been aware of this. So I'm going back to Wisconsin in June for my cousin's wedding. My cousin is in a very different cultural world than I am. I mean, not just politically, but culturally. I love my cousin. He's a great dude. There are things we don't talk about, and that's okay. We shouldn't talk about them because anyways. But so I've been thinking a lot about the cultural changes that I've experienced over the course of my lifetime. Because had I stayed in Northeast Michigan, by the way, my county was in the news. Anybody see this? What? Alpena County, the 8-year-old that was almost abducted by the 17-year-old and her teenage brother, shot the abductor with a slingshot. That's my county. That's where I grew up. You're welcome for your weekly entertainment. So I often ask the question, if I had stayed in Alpena County and did what so many of my friends did, married a local girl and had kids, worked the farm, what would my cultural identity be, right? If we're talking about this, if I hadn't met my French wife, well, how would I be different? One of the things, she saved me. I have been saved.
If I had stayed in Texas.
If you had, yeah, right? Yeah. If you had stayed in Texas.
That's a whole other story.
Every time I hear the word Texas, I hear my dad singing, "All my exes live in Texas." It's just, he's a gem. He's a source of never-ending inspiration. Who, by the way, tried to cut his arm off with a chainsaw this week. Yeah, he had to go and get 18 stitches because somebody, this is such a bad story. Somebody gave him a chainsaw. He's got plenty of chainsaws, but somebody gave him a chainsaw. It was a small one that they weren't using anymore. So my dad decided he was going to trim the evergreen trees that are in the front lawn. Cut the low branches off because they're a pain to mow under, right? And it's one of those chainsaws that have like a plastic guard on, and he tried to pull the guard off while the chainsaw was still running. Caught his sleeve in it. Yeah, missed the arteries, missed the tendons, which is why I still have a dad. But he is not going to hear the end of this. I'm going to see him in June. I'm going to see him in June at the wedding.
Does he not watch these commercials about older people? And you're not supposed to do that when you're that age.
No. This is one of the many reasons that losing my mother was tragic, because his life expectancy was lowered significantly when she left the scene. Due to accident, by the way. So I often wonder, where would my cultural identity be? Because one of the things about discipleship is that discipleship is incompatible with cultural identity. Okay, this is what believe it or not, this is what we've been talking about this entire time. But the greatest temptation in the world is to conflate the two, right? That my tribe is what it means to follow Jesus. Okay. Believe it or not, this is exactly what the early disciples, early apostles were struggling with as well, in many, many, many ways. At face value, here was one of the first big challenges. Does being Christian, I wrote Christian way too big, but I can fit it in, equal being Jewish? Which in 2021, or 2023, whatever here we're in, the 21st century, seems like a really odd thing to think about, especially considering that Christianity's history of anti-Semitism, et cetera, the Holocaust, enough said. But this was the early problem. This was the early cultural struggle that so many of the early apostles had was, are others allowed? Can other people follow Jesus? And what's the word that they use for the others? How did the other people? Gentiles, right? Gentile is not a cultural, it's not an identifier of an ethnicity or a race. It literally means everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not Jewish.
The goyim, exactly.
Not Jewish.
But let's be real. It's because the Jews are unconditionally chosen by God.
Says it.
Unconditionally.
Says it in the Bible.
No
even.
question that the Jews are going to get it.
In this case, it absolutely says it in the Bible. Absolutely says, and I'm not being sarcastic, right? If anybody has a case, by the way, for unconditional, chosen divine love, it's the Jews. Straight up.
And they use it against everybody else.
Historically, I don't want to speak for modern Judaism in any regard. Yeah, but it has historically been used in that regard. To be fair, we do the exact. Yeah. So here was the early problem, but there were other early issues as well too. Here's another one. Right? Can Christians be women? Right? Which seems like a strange thing to ask because it's not about being saved at this point. It's about who gets to participate. I erased discipleship. I regret that now. But who gets to participate, right? So we read the story about replacing Judas, right? Were there any women in the running for that role? Nope. I don't know.
And there were a couple that should have been.
Mary, Martha, the other Mary, and the other Mary, right? Right.
Well, I just want to throw this in because I'm getting
Get out of here, Paul.
The Protestant choice to let Mary just drift off into the ether.
I actually had a conversation about this the other day.
It's also an important problem for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, we'll get there. The cult of Mary might not come up in this topic, but we'll get there. The veneration of Mary, I should say. So yeah, so this was another one, okay?
Well, in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, women still can't do everything.
Right? And this, here's the thing, is that both of these are still actually pretty relevant, right? So even in recent history, it's not necessarily a question of whether or not Jews are Christians, it's right, whether Jews are wrong or whether they can be saved, et cetera, right? So obviously, this is still relevant, especially as of 1942. But so is this one, right, Pat? Right? So many of our Christian denominations, our sisters and brothers in Missouri Synod also struggle with this question. And of course, they've got, in their mind, good scriptural reasons. It's maybe Timothy's fault, but whatever.
Well, and you continue on to modernism, and you can put in the LGBTQ.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm going with this, by the way. Is that the history of Christianity has been a prolongation of the same struggle that the first disciples struggled with, which is in the beginning, and this is rude math, but in the beginning there were 12, right? And then there were more, there were 70 perhaps, and there were 700. And then what we're going to read in the book of Acts as we walk through Acts is, and 3,000 were saved, and then 5,000 were saved, right? And so this circle keeps growing bigger and bigger. But what happens as you expand your circle? It's the same problem that we're struggling with in the modern world. As your circle, as your understanding of who are your people, you run into exceptions, right? Because you say, well, no, that can't be them. They can't be there. What happens for these guys is, first they struggle with the idea of women. Well, not first, in concert with other things, right? But here's one of the profound things that we're going to read about in the book of Acts is how many women are present in the book of Acts, named and unnamed, right? Obviously, whoever writes the Luke Acts narrative, despite whether or not these women were marked as official disciples, the writer of the Luke Acts narrative understood them to be participating in the Christian thing, right? We already named one of them, which is as that circle gets bigger, they immediately bump into this idea of, well, but what about everybody else? What about the Gentiles, right? So Christianity has expanded to incorporate potentially ethnic groups that we didn't imagine, because again, one of the realities is that Jews don't just live in Jerusalem, right? Jews don't just live in Galilee in the first century. They live in other lands. And so I imagine that some of the struggles that they run into early on are, yeah, but what about the people that live in Tyre or Sidon or the Decapolis, or, what about, in Egypt? And so what are the things that the early Christian apostles do? They go to these places, right? So our early Pauline letters are to places like what? Philippi, Ephesus, Corinth, right? Places outside of the Jewish sphere at that point in time. But here's the thing that we need to think about, right? So Paul is remarkable in that Paul has this conversion experience, right? But Paul is not, sometimes is going and recruiting Gentiles, but that's not primarily how he's doing it. Paul is going to Jewish enclaves in these places and converting people to Christianity, right? So these are early on Jewish communities that are converting to Christianity that then later on begin to incorporate Gentiles. Paul is non-exclusionary. He preached to anybody, but he's a smart guy, and so he starts with Jewish communities, right? So that circle expands. But here's how this is relevant. It's important to understand why all this is relevant. Is that process, this ever-expanding circle, is still going on. It's still going on. So obviously we've named, already up here, people of other faiths, women. We're still not done debating about that. But, in recent years, right? Are they in a circle? African Americans, Hispanics, people of different ethnicities, people of different cultures, even people that identify as Christians, people of different denominations, right? Are they in the circle? And so when we talk about, this is where I'm theoretically tying the two studies together. When we talk about this idea of discipleship, we're doing, even today, the same work that the early apostles were doing. So, 10:35, I got 10 minutes, perfect. So let's talk about this real quick. Let's talk about what that early process looked like. If you want to turn, well, I'm going to read a verse that we already read. I'm in Luke chapter 6. And I'm just going to read verses 12 through 16 real quick. So who were the first ones? Who were the first dudes? Right? We already went over this, but one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, Simon Peter, Simon's brother Andrew. I don't know how to. I don't know where
You may read the rest of it for you around.
Yeah, you read them. James, John. These are the sons of Zebedee, right? Philip.
Bartholomew.
Yep.
Matthew. Thomas. James.
Another James. This is James, son of Alphaeus, I believe.
And another Simon.
Another Simon. And Judas. The Judas. Who later gets replaced by Matthias. Via the coin flip.
Is it the labels that get in our way? We label people, or they label
Luke.
You could make the argument that it's one and the same thing, is that we label people to justify our othering of them, but because we label them, we also other them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right, because why do we need specialized names other than a reason to be able to tell who isn't us? But to be fair though, right? This is a human. This is a survival trait of humanity. is that we have, being able to I mean, in fact, you could argue this is a trait of consciousness, right? To be able to identify the other as different and as distinct from ourselves.
It's a cultural thing.
Yeah, but like, for example, dogs, most dogs can't really watch TV because they don't identify the moving colors on the screen as being representative of individuals, except for my younger dog loves to watch TV and barks at the dogs on TV. Madeline, the older dog, is just sitting there wondering what the heck is wrong with him, right? But yeah, human beings possess this wonderful trait, which is, consciousness, right? Well, dogs are conscious in a different way, but we possess the ability to distinguish others, to distinguish others from ourselves, to categorize, to separate, to identify which plants are poisonous. I mean, and all animals do this to a certain regard, but we're really good at it, right? We're so good that it tends to bite us in the butt. Okay, so these are the 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Good. Just to make sure.
Well, there's Jude. So Matthias replaced Judas, but there's.
Oh yeah. Then we're missing one. 1, 2.
Peter. Peter's up there.
I got Simon Peter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who are we missing? Matthew, Thomas, James, Simon. Jude. There's 2 Judases. Judas, son of James. And Judas Iscariot. Okay. We're not going to track all these people. Okay? Right off the bat, right, this guy's out. We don't hear anything about that Judas anymore. Bartholomew, I think, pops up in Acts, but we don't really follow him too much. Philip, we're going to see again. Philip has some fascinating stories in the book of Acts. James and John, we don't see as much in Acts, but we're going to try and track them down a little bit because these guys are close with this dude. We are going to follow Simon / Peter. Andrew, being Peter's brother, is probably in that same group. Thomas has some great apocryphal stories written about him. So Thomas is the one that supposedly goes to India, right? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna track down Thomas. Matthew, there's not much about Matthew, unfortunately. Matthew kind of drops off the radar. James, son of Alphaeus, not a whole lot either. And obviously this other Simon, not too much. Okay. So here's the thing. We essentially have kind of like, excuse me. We've already created one category of people that we're going to track, which is the 12. Okay. For the most part, these folks, their history is all kind of intertwined. Okay. Here's the reason. Okay. They do leave Jerusalem for a time. So a lot of this stuff that takes place in the book of Acts actually happens, well, some of it happens in Jerusalem, some of it happens out of Jerusalem. But ultimately, this is where Peter winds up. And we imagine that Andrew goes with Peter, the sons of Zebedee go with Peter, they're all hanging out together. The early picture of Christianity is this guy versus these folks, okay? And many of these guys, by the way, don't make it to live as a contemporary of Paul. Paul is younger than these people, by the way, right? So Paul, reminder, Paul does most of his work in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Well, 50s, 60s, 70s, actually, the better space of it, which is...
Was he even born when Jesus was around?
Yes, he would have been, but just barely. I can't remember Paul's birth date. It's an estimation, right? We don't know. But here's how we're gonna spend at least the next couple of weeks. Is we're gonna be tracking the paths of this group of people versus this guy. Okay. This guy is almost single-handedly responsible for the survival of Christianity beyond the 2nd century time era. Okay. So all of these cities that we named, right? So Philippi, Colossus, Corinth, Galatia is a region, it's not a city, Ephesus. These are all letters that are written to these communities by this person. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the book of Acts. We're going to skim through the book of Acts. I'm going to cherry pick some stories. We're not going to read everything. Okay? But we're going to cherry pick stories that talk about these folks and this guy. Okay? I'm hoping we can do the book of Acts in a couple of weeks, because again, we're not gonna deep dive into every single story. But then where we're going to go with it afterwards is we're going to try and pick apart. We already mentioned Thomas. We're gonna pull in stories that are non-canonical, right? In other words, stories that aren't in the Bible but are history is a strong word, right? Traditions. We're going to look at the traditions regarding the different apostles. And here's the purpose. Here's where all of this is leading. Is that as promised, we're essentially going to create a picture of how Christianity becomes a thing, right? So we're going to look at the paths of the apostles, but specifically so we can understand how we go from 12 to 70 to 700 to approximately 325 million by the end of the 4th century common era, right? It's a fascinating, fascinating process. One of the things that we're gonna do in this as well is we're not gonna just look at people who had names. Okay, that sounds weird. But the people who were responsible for this, a lot of them were women. Okay. One of the major mechanisms by which Christianity expands in the Gentile, in the Greek-speaking world, is by women. Okay, because 10:45. Okay, well, spoiler for next week. But this is one of the major agents in the expansion of Christianity. So here's the scope of the next several weeks. We're going to go from essentially 30, we'll call it 30 Common Era, to let's say 390 Common Era, whenever the Council of Trent is, somewhere around there. Make sense?
Okay.
Cool. All right, folks. See you next Sunday. Happy Mother's Day. We'll hear it again.
That's right.
She might.